It is the always provocative science writer Richard Dawkins who really began his writing career with a book entitled The Selfish Gene. And when Dawkins writes about the word selfish and gene, he's talking about the tendency of genetic material to act in its own interest in order to perpetuate itself. And he argues that that's really the linchpin of the whole concept of natural selection. Now, whatever it is you think about Dawkins' science, you got to give him credit for a catchy title, The Selfish Gene. Because the truth is, the title is pretty accurate for not just our genes, but our lives. I'm sure most of us would have a hard time admitting, but would finally have to admit that we humans really do have this selfish gene or something like that, this kind of innate, this sort of consistent tendency to act in our own interest. And when push comes to shove, to do things for ourselves first. Call it a selfish gene, call it the sinful nature, but pursuing and protecting our own well-being at the expense of others is often kind of the default of how our lives get lived. Now, we might hope that it would be radically different when it comes to being followers of Christ, but it's just not always the case. By our own nature, we seem to be people that get self-absorbed, self-promoting, self-protecting, self-serving, self-reliant. And until we finally just face the music about that, we're really not going to get very far with learning what it means to do these one another statements that we're looking at. Now, so far, we've talked about the whole idea of welcoming one another and of accepting one another. And this morning, I want us to look at the whole idea of honoring one another. Now, as we've done in the past, we're going to just kind of pull 2-3 different verses with that theme and see what we can piece together when it comes to that whole idea. This week, or this weekend, we're talking obviously about honoring our moms, and we have every reasonable reason and duty to do just that. But what does that look like to extend that honor not just to our parents, but to one another? Well, that's what we're going to look at when we see these statements. So the first one that we're going to look at this morning comes from Romans 12. Now, we've gone to this verse or this chapter a couple times in this passage or this series so far, because this passage, this chapter, is just loaded with these one another statements. Here's one more for us to look at today. Verse 10. So be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Now, what does that mean? I mean, what does honor even really mean? Well, the word in the Greek, the Old Testament language, meant to literally give something weight. So when you honor someone, you give their perspective, their viewpoint, their lives, a sense of weightiness in your life. You don't just blow them off. You don't just kind of run roughshod over them. You stop to give who they are a sense of weightiness in your life. And that's what we do whenever we honor someone. We recognize their weight or their value to us. We respect and celebrate their accomplishments, and we honor them by affirming them and appreciating them and applauding them. And back in Jesus' day, honor was a highly prized kind of practice in the culture. It was usually ascribed to people of great wealth or great knowledge or great power or great status. And I suppose it's not all that different today. When a student gets good grades, they get to make the honor roll. When a soldier distinguishes themselves in the field of battle, they receive a medal of honor. And so whenever someone does something that's just extraordinary or outstanding or remarkable or significant, we honor them. What's surprising, though, is that Paul here tells us that we are not just to honor those people that extraordinarily stand out. We're to honor everyone. We are to honor one another as if everyone is worthy of being affirmed by us and valued by us and appreciated and applauded even by us. So when we say honor one another, we say we're called to give each person that's among us that kind of valuing. And he says to do so above yourselves. In other words, to think about the people around you as more valuable, more significant than yourselves. Now, that runs right counter to that selfish gene inside of us. But that's what Paul calls us to do. Now, there's all kinds of ways we can do that. Now, there's lots of ways we can do that right here at Family in Christ. We're getting down to the end of a school year in terms of our various ministries, our GEMS program that meets on Wednesday night, our cadet program. One of the ways we can honor is to thank those people, those adults that have been so instrumental in the running of those ministries throughout the whole school year. Perhaps you could write a note to that leader and thank them for the impact they've had on your child's life. You can honor someone by publicly thanking them for the ministry they've had in the life group perhaps you've been in. You can publicly, when the rest of the group's together, thank them for what they have meant to you over this past year. Honoring one another means speaking highly about the people that have been a part of your life. And when we do that deliberately, when we do that in explicit kind of ways, we create a culture here of honoring each other. And we can honor each other better at home as well. When you provide care and dignity to that aging mom or dad of yours, you are honoring them. When you remember that relative's birthday and take the time to send a card or to text them or to let them know that you're thinking about them. When they hit a milestone at work or when they graduate, you get a chance to honor them by recognizing them and speaking highly about them in public with others. There are all kinds of ways you can honor. Parents, you can honor your kids by looking at them in the eye and affirming who they are with a unique talent and the gifts and the personality that God gave them. Husbands, wives, you honor each other when you speak highly about each other in front of friends and family. We end up kids allow themselves to honor their parents by taking time to listen and to respect the parents that God gave them. And so there's all kinds of ways we honor each other, but Paul's whole idea is that honor is something that's worthy of everyone. And so here's that first blank, if you're filling them in. When we honor one another, we acknowledge that everyone is worthy of our appreciation. Second way we can honor each other is to defer to one another. Philippians 2 says, don't do anything out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility, consider others better than yourselves. To defer to someone is simply to give way to them. So when there's a clash of personalities, when there's a competing interest, when there's a difference of opinion, you deliberately give way to the other person. You let them make the decision. You allow things to go their way. You allow them to have the spotlight. To defer is to give way to their needs and their desires. And that is not easy to do. That selfish gene is active much of the time when those kind of opportunities arise. I mean, when was the last time you walked by the family room and heard your kids saying, no, you go ahead, sis, take another turn on the Xbox. I just like watching you play. I'll just sit back and watch. Or when was the last time that, you're kind of coming on the entrance ramp on the Boulder Turnpike and someone just cuts you off and you just sweetly smile and say, go right ahead, it's just fine with me. Giving way is not easy to do. That selfish gene is alive and well and on so often. When it comes to speaking and thinking and acting in our own interests, that's often the default for us. Now, Paul's not suggesting here that we literally welcome or literally view the other people as more valuable. We're all of equal value in God's eyes. God doesn't play favorites. Everybody in the body of Christ has equal value and weight and importance here. But what Paul is saying is consider the other person more important. Think about them that way, not because you have to, but because you choose to defer to them. And then he goes on in verse 4, each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interest of others. Now, notice that it's okay to have your own interests. Paul doesn't deny that. It's okay to pursue your own interests. The passage isn't suggesting that, you just ignore your own needs or interests to be a doormat or something. It's not about neglecting yourself so that you're no good to anyone else. It's not about burning yourself out by serving people so that you're not any good to anyone. It's okay to have interests. It's okay to pursue them. But he's reminding us to be as concerned about their needs, their interests, as your own. Whenever possible, to put their needs, their interests, their preferences ahead of your own. And so deferring to one another, it means being willing to serve behind the scenes. Behind the sound booth, behind the nursery walls, behind and underneath the radar of the eyes of so many other people. To be willing to serve quietly and sometimes without a lot of fanfare. Deferring means holding back your need to talk at your life group so that you can give other people a chance to talk. It means serving in a place where most people are not really interested in serving. And deferring at work means to let someone else take the credit for the project, even though you did most of the work. Deferring to someone else might mean volunteering for that lousy assignment, even though you've got the seniority in the whole deal. Deferring might mean making the next pot of coffee, even though you weren't the one that finished off the last pot. Deferring at home means listening to your kids, when really you'd truthfully rather just be on Facebook catching up, or being willing to just be with that child rather than watch a television show. Letting someone else have the remote, even though you'd prefer to have it yourself. Deferring to one another means putting their needs first. That's the second thing. And the third way that we honor one another is found in 1 Peter 5. Listen, all of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourself, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. Now, what is humility exactly? Well, Paul gives us a hint in the previous passage when he says, consider others better than yourselves. And so humility is kind of a way of thinking about yourself in relationship to other people. Humility is not thinking poorly of yourself. Being a humble person doesn't mean that you feel inadequate or unworthy. It means that you know who you are, what you are, and you choose to deliberately lower yourself so you can serve someone. And there's no better verse in the whole Bible about this than John's Gospel, chapter 13, when we hear the story of Jesus on the last night before his death. He's gathered all those disciples of his around for this final meal together. And then we read these words from verse 3. So Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So how would you fill in the blank? You know God's brought you here. He's given you all this power. Everything you are, he has initiated. And you know that not only did he send you, but he has this future beyond today that's unbelievable. So, what would you do next? He came from God, was returning to God. So, here's what he did. He got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist, and began to wash their feet. Now, that's an extraordinary moment. In fact, if you remember the story, you may remember that it was Peter that was just so shaken by the whole idea of the master washing the feet of his followers, that he objected violently at the beginning. And I'm also convinced that that very memory of that very night was on his mind and heart when many, many years later, he wrote a letter called 1 Peter and said these words in chapter 5. So all of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. And that word clothe yourself literally means to tie or to fasten something around yourself. The way that you tie an apron around your waist. In fact, that was in many ways the distinguishing mark of a slave in the Roman times. That they would wrap these aprons around their waists and leave them there all day to protect their clothing, but more importantly, for the larger culture's purposes, to help people identify this man is nothing but a slave. And so what Jesus is saying is, you can do that. You can see yourself as someone that wraps an apron around your waist so that you can see yourself as someone that's serving other people. In fact, I'm struck by, we have a greeting team around here, and they have a name tag on, and that's to not just tell you what their name is, it's also there to say to you, to those who are visiting with us, welcome, I'm here to help. What can I help you with? And what would happen if, we've got name tags on today, many of us, but what would happen if every week when we came to church, whether we had a literal name tag on or not, we had in our hearts the idea that there was something on us that reminds us that we're here to help, that we're here to welcome, that we're here to serve each other. That's what Paul's talking about here. How can I encourage and support and serve you? What Peter is getting at is clothe yourself with humility toward one another. Tie an apron around yourself every day, and then stoop down so you can be in a place to serve. And that's, by the way, the third blank. Practicing humility means stooping down to serve. Now, right about now, there's a little voice in many of your heads that is beginning to speak to you, saying, well, that's all good and fine for me to serve other people, to humble myself, to put them first, to honor them. But what about me? What about me? I don't deny that that voice is there, that selfish gene is very much still active in our lives. What about my interests? What about my desires? If I put other people first, who will help and take care of me? Now, if that's the voice in your head, don't feel bad about that. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means you are a human person. And it's a fair question. If we put other people first, who will take care of us? Well, the answer is right here in 1 Peter 5. So all of you, clothe yourself with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, gives grace to the humble. Humble yourself, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. You see, when we lower ourselves, God lifts us up. When we care for others, God cares for us. We don't need to fret about our own needs, our own desires, our own interests. God already knows all of those things, and he promises to meet those needs or to replace those needs with things that are even better and more satisfying than we could ever imagine when we put other people first. And so, number 4, the blank, when we honor others, God honors us. And when we put their needs first, God makes up the difference. That's, by the way, the 5th blank. When we put their needs first, God makes up the difference. When we honor others, God honors us. When we care for others, God cares for us. When we give way to others, he gives to us. And you can't outgive God. And when we humble ourselves, when we stoop down to serve others, God lifts us up to levels of joy and fulfillment and meaning we could never imagine. And I could spend all day talking about examples of this. A couple weeks ago, a whole bunch of folks here from Family in Christ were up at the Sterling Correctional Facility. They spent 4 days inside that penitentiary ministering to about 40 men who were part of a kind of a men's retreat, if you will, over the weekend. And these men who've been locked up sometimes for years gathered together. They heard people that were part of the group talking about the hope that Christ offers to them and the gospel that gives them a second chance. And as a result of those 4 days, extraordinary things happened in the lives of those men. And some of you may have been there when they've done one of these closing and heard some of the stories of what has happened to them. And I watched as those guys came back the following week and talked to them, and they didn't need a floor to walk on. They were floating on a cloud because of the wonder that happens when they realized God had used them in such a powerful way. When you're willing to serve others, then you experience the kind of joy and purpose and meaning that you can hardly ever imagine. God used you. And when he uses you, there is nothing that fills us with more joy than that. Well, last week, a bunch of folks right after this service, a dozen, I think, gathered together and began to dream about how they could share the love of Jesus to the working poor who live in ramshackle motels on East Colfax. And they began to dream about one night a week, just kind of going around and passing out some food to these folks who are just, they work, but they barely survive sometimes. They can't afford an apartment. They can't afford the deposit. So they just spend their weeks, sometimes months, in these motels. And to knock on a door and to be able to offer some food and a prayer for them. And as we do those sorts of things, we see how God uses us in such extraordinary ways. There are all kinds of ways where we can wrap a towel around our waist and say, how can I help? I would just tell you, the happiest people I know, without exception, are the people that have learned the joy that comes in serving others. See, when we take care of other people's needs, God fills in the gap, gives us his joy and satisfaction and love and fulfillment. In fact, that's really the kind of theme of this whole service or this whole series. When we do life together, whether it's greeting one another or accepting one another, or whether it's honoring one another, when we make room for others in our lives, God moves into the room that we open up and provides his grace and blessing to us. So that's the third thing, the final thing. When we stoop down to serve, God lifts us up. So let me just close with 5 action steps. I've generally just tried to kind of come up with a few ideas for how you could kind of live this out. Some of these will apply to you. Maybe all of them will apply to you. Maybe none of them this week will apply to you. But I'm just going to throw them against the wall. Whatever sticks, let it stick. Number 1. Find someone to honor this week. Now, I hope the person you're going to honor today is going to be that mom, if she's alive. Those people that have made such a difference in your life as caregivers. But what about tomorrow? And what about the rest of the week? How could you honor someone this week? Who could you send a card to, or throw a party for, or make a phone call to, or send a text to, or just have them sit down with you over a cup of coffee and tell them face to face how much you appreciate them, how much they mean to you? That's one thing you might want to think about. Find someone to honor this week. Let them know what they mean to you. Number 2, practice going last. Just an idea, maybe it doesn't kind of register with you, but when you go to the supermarket, instead of trying to needle into the very first place that's in the line, why not deliberately invite the person that's next to you to go first? Now, that's not too unusual, perhaps, but how about if you invite the next person behind them to go next, and then the next person after? If you keep doing that 3 or 4 times, everybody will look at you, and they will wonder, what are you doing? And you will lose a lot of time, or at least some time. But what you will also do is you will find that when you do that kind of thing, you're just filled with a sense of joy about that. When you put other people first, just the act of doing that brings joy to you. And so that's the second thing. Practice going last. Number 3, tie one on. An apron, that is. So when you get dressed tomorrow morning, imagine in your own memory that the last accessory that you put on as you look in front of the mirror is that you just kind of, in your own mind, put this apron on and tie it. And then as you walk out the door, you ask God to give you opportunities to serve the people that he places in your path. And as you meet people, you ask this question: how can I make their life today easier or better or happier? How can I make their life today easier or better or happier? That's what a servant is doing. And finally, number 4, find a place to serve people. There are all kinds of places you could serve people right around here. As the children's ministry get ready for their vacation Bible school, they are always needing other adults who can kind of come alongside and offer kind of support and just be present with the kids along the way. You could host a small group this coming fall. You could help out in the office. We're always looking for people that can come in for a couple hours each week to help along the way. You could join the mowing crew that kind of keeps the grounds looking good during the summertime. There's all kinds of ways. If you're not sure what that looks like, talk to somebody at the Welcome Center. But find a place to serve. And when you're willing to serve, you'll find that the benefits to you will just be far more than you end up giving. And then finally, the last thing is surrender yourself to God. That selfish gene that's kind of inside of you, that selfish tendency, the only way to turn it off, the only way to get rid of it, is to offer it to God. And this is the beginning and really the ending of the one another's, because until we surrender to God, we'll never be able to surrender to one another. Until we surrender to God, we'll never be able to do any of these one another's. First, surrender to God. When we finally yield to Him, when we put Him first in our life, when we allow Him to be at the center of who we are, then we're free to put others first. Because when you put Him first, then you have the freedom to put others first, and He fills in the rest. All the needs you've ever thought you had to take care of yourself, He provides for you. And you find yourself and your life filled with purpose and joy of knowing that He's using you. That's what it means to honor one another. Let's pray together. Father, we're so grateful for how you do indeed firsthand show us what it means to honor and serve each other. As we remember how Jesus did that in the final act of His life on that last night, and how He was truly, literally a servant to those that He was asking to follow Him. And we know you call us and ask us to follow you by doing the same, to being willing to be servants and offering ourselves to each other. And so keep inviting us and calling us and needling us to be your people that serve each other and serve your world. In Jesus' name, amen.